Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Linda and Patrick Duffy. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Linda Doreen Duffy was born in March 1958 and lived in the state of California. Sometime around 1985, she became romantically involved with a radio engineer named Patrick Albert Duffy. He was a couple of years older than Linda, having been born in 1956. The couple married in 1989 and purchased a 3-bedroom, 1,700-square-foot house in 1990. It was on Sharon Hill Drive in Whittier, California, not far from Los Angeles. The couple went on to have 2 sons, Sean and Thomas. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On April 26, 2007, at 2:51 p.m., Linda Duffy called 911 and offered a lengthy explanation to the operator about a tragedy that just occurred in her house. Linda explained how her husband Patrick was going to a shooting range. He was showing her how to use a gun. Linda thought that her husband said the gun was not loaded. A long time ago, he had showed her how to pull the thing back on the top of the gun and pull the trigger real fast. This is what she did. Linda shot her husband accidentally as he was on the couch. According to Linda, her husband was still breathing. The operator gave her instructions to apply pressure to the wound, which she did. When first responders arrived, they found Linda behind the couch, holding a towel on Patrick's head. Patrick did not appear to be breathing. First responders tried to help Patrick, but he did not survive. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Patrick was on the couch with his head resting on a pillow, facing the television, which was on. His right hand was next to his body, and his left hand was inside his pants pocket. It was clear that he had a severe head wound. At the scene, Linda told the police that she accidentally shot Patrick while practicing rapid firing with a .38 caliber double-action revolver. She demonstrated how she held the revolver with one hand and used the side of her other hand to pull back the hammer and release it repeatedly. Linda was referring to a technique called fanning the hammer or fan firing, which is often featured in westerns using single-action revolvers. The operator will hold the trigger with their dominant hand and use the side or the palm of their other hand to repeatedly pull back and release the hammer. This allows the operator to rapidly fire the weapon. Technically, a person can fan the hammer of a double-action revolver if they want to, but it won't function the same way because the trigger would have to be released and pulled between each shot. To rapid-fire a double-action revolver, one simply needs to pull the trigger repeatedly. There is no sense in attempting to fan the hammer. Linda explained how when she was fanning the hammer, her husband laid down in front of the barrel just as the gun went off. This story was a little different than what she told the 911 operator. Later, Linda was interviewed at the police station. She explained in more detail what happened. She and Patrick had come home from an appointment Patrick had with a physician. He intended on going to the firing range that day, so he pulled out his firearms. Linda decided to pick up a .38 caliber revolver, even though she normally did not touch any of the weapons. She and Patrick would joke around a lot, and sometimes they would pretend to be cartoon characters. Using a voice like Elmer Fudd from a Bugs Bunny cartoon, Patrick said, "No more bullets." This is how Elmer Fudd pronounced the word bullets. He, of course, was referring to cartridges, not bullets, highlighting one of the many ways that Elmer Fudd demonstrated a lack of knowledge about firearms. Linda assumed that Patrick's cartoon impersonation meant that the revolver was not loaded. Wanting to impress her husband by shooting cowboy style, she fanned the hammer. As she was doing this, Patrick leaned in front of the barrel of the revolver. Investigators had several concerns about Linda's story. Fanning the hammer is not easy with the double-action revolver. Patrick's position on the couch was consistent with sleeping, rather than giving his wife a lesson on firearms. And an autopsy revealed that Patrick had been shot twice. This strongly supported the theory that Linda had murdered him. Despite this evidence, the police thought this could have been an accident. Maybe Linda was telling the truth. They viewed Linda as erratic, eccentric, and quirky. the kind of person who may impulsively discharge a firearm, thinking it was unloaded based on the advice of a husband impersonating Elmer Fudd. The case was put on the back burner, and nothing really happened with it for some time. In 2008, Linda Duffy became romantically involved with a saxophone player named Lawrence Watts after meeting him on a dating website. Linda was ready to move on with her life. In January 2009, the police interviewed Linda for a second time. They had concerns about how difficult it was to fan the hammer of a double-action revolver. They showed her a video of someone trying to do this. Linda modified her story and said that she had practiced fan-firing revolvers for years. Originally, she had told the police that she never fired a gun in her entire life. The detectives offered to take Linda to a firing range with the same model of revolver used in the killing so she could demonstrate her impressive fan-firing skills. They let her go and waited to hear from her. Not surprisingly, she never contacted them to schedule her cowboy shooting performance. Linda seemed eager to put the entire situation in her rearview mirror. She moved to Mississippi to be with her lover, Lawrence. In 2010, Linda found work at a university where Lawrence was employed. At some point, she married Lawrence. Her name was now Linda Doreen Watts. The detectives assigned to investigate Patrick's death became preoccupied with other cases. They did not return to this case until 2012, at which time they felt there was enough evidence to arrest Linda in connection with Patrick's death. On May 22, 2012, Linda was arrested in Mississippi, where she lived, and charged with murder. She was extradited to California to face trial. On January 22, 2014, the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict, and a mistrial was declared. Linda went on trial for a second time. On January 23, 2015, she was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury also found true a special allegation that Linda intentionally discharged a firearm, causing great bodily injury and death. On April 24, 2015, Linda was sentenced to a term of 15 years to life in prison, plus 25 years to life in prison for the firearm enhancement. This meant that her sentence was 40 years to life in prison. Linda will be eligible for parole in 2032, when she will be 74 years old. Now moving to my analysis. Linda maintains her innocence and has a number of supporters, including her two sons and her husband. They argue that there is no way the shooting was intentional. The state, of course, disagrees. They argue that the idea of shooting someone twice in the head by accident is preposterous. This brings me to the question, was Linda guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that she was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Patrick had a $300,000 life insurance policy. After his death, a judge ordered this to go to Linda's sons. Linda's story about fanning the hammer of a double-action revolver does not make any sense. As I mentioned, fan firing is a technique associated with single-action revolvers. Even if one were to believe that Linda was attempting to fan fire a double-action revolver, that would only explain the revolver discharging one time. Linda fired the weapon twice. Why did she keep firing after the first shot? One would think that the gun discharging unexpectedly would have surprised her and she would have stopped firing. Linda maintained that both shots were accidental, yet out of all the places the bullets could have traveled, they both struck her husband Patrick in the head. They did not strike the couch, they didn't strike a wall, they didn't strike the floor, they didn't strike the ceiling. They just happened to go where they would cause the death of her husband. Linda's story changed each time she was interviewed. For example, she first stated that Patrick was on the couch when the gun discharged. Later, she claimed that he moved his head in front of the barrel just as she fired the weapon. After finding out how difficult it is to fan fire a double-action revolver, Linda changed her story and said that she had practiced many times. The position of Patrick's body was consistent with him sleeping, not giving a firearm lesson. For example, his left hand was in his pocket and his right knee was being supported by a pillow. Patrick was experienced with firearms. Why would he move his head in front of the barrel of a revolver? Linda initially told Patrick's siblings that he accidentally discharged the weapon himself, which is different than what she told the police. One acquaintance of Linda implied that Linda was a pathological liar. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Patrick's life insurance policy had been purchased many years earlier. After Patrick's death, Linda never pursued his work benefits. The police could not find any motive for Linda to murder her husband. Patrick had 2 single-action revolvers in the house in addition to the double-action revolver. It's possible that fanning the hammer was something that Linda had seen him do on these single-action revolvers. Maybe Linda believed that the double-action revolver she retrieved was single-action. This is why she tried fanning the hammer. One of the detectives investigating the killing initially believed that Linda could be telling the truth. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Linda was guilty of murder? Yes, she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. For some reason, Linda decided she wanted to murder her husband Patrick. Her motive is not clear. One possibility is that Linda was concerned she was going to have to take care of Patrick because he had a circulation problem. He had just come back from a physician's appointment when she killed him. Maybe he received information during that appointment about how his activity would be restricted in the future. Linda was not happy about this change. She did not want to be tied down to someone who was inactive. Whatever the motive, Linda was determined to kill Patrick. She came up with this idea of blaming a negligent discharge of a firearm. Linda was familiar with the idea of fanning the hammer of a single-action revolver, having seen Patrick engage in this activity. She thought that she could grab one of those revolvers and have an unfortunate accident. Not knowing anything about guns, Linda selected a double-action revolver by mistake. Linda only intended on shooting Patrick one time, but then after the first gunshot, Linda was worried that Patrick was not dead. She fired for a second time, which greatly undermined her negligent discharge story. One would think that firing twice would have pretty much eliminated any chance of anyone believing Linda's narrative. However, she was remarkably convincing. The absence of a motive combined with her eccentric nature led some people to believe her story. Patrick Duffy's death was put on the back burner by the police because they did not view Linda as a danger to kill anyone else. Linda was not worried about being arrested. She moved on with her life. When she finally was arrested 5 years later, she was stunned. At her first trial, not all the jury members were convinced that Linda was guilty. At her second trial, the prosecution left out a lot of evidence and focused their case on the fact that Linda shot her husband in the head twice. This strategy led to a conviction, although there was still some doubt. Some members of the jury were frustrated by the absence of any motive. Now moving to my final thoughts. In my opinion, the most surprising aspect of this case is how anyone thought that Linda was not guilty. I did not view this as a case that glided along a razor's edge between guilt and innocence. It seemed fairly obvious that Linda killed her husband on purpose. Patrick was shot 2 times in the head with a double-action revolver. It's not like Linda was operating a machine gun and lost control. Firing a double-action revolver requires the trigger to be pulled twice. This did not happen by accident. I think that people became caught up in this idea that Linda did not look like a killer. What's so frightening about this case is how easily Linda could have escaped responsibility. Very small changes could have resulted in her avoiding charges or being found not guilty. For example, if Linda had only fired the revolver one time, if Linda had selected a single-action revolver because her fanning the hammer story would have been more believable, if Linda had not changed her story about how her husband's head ended up in front of the barrel, and if Linda had practiced fanning the hammer of a double-action revolver, because she could have dazzled the police with a demonstration at the firing range. Again, they offered her the opportunity to prove her skill. Ultimately, Linda made too many mistakes to avoid going to prison. Her story about fanning the hammer has given way to a life of manning the slammer. Those are my thoughts on the case of Linda and Patrick Duffy. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.